Hello everybody, welcome back to a new video. My name is Sarah and today I'm going to go through my February wrap-up. Wow, first of all, I didn't mean to just kind of drop off the face of the earth there for nearly a month. February was a very busy and stressful month for work, and making videos kind of went on the back burner, and I just mostly focused on making it through work and reading in my free time in order to de-stress. And so because of that, I did manage to read 6 books this month, which is like a good number, but my ratings were definitely not as good as January. Overall, it felt like a pretty average month, which it's not bad, but there was definitely like a big disappointment in there, which I will get to further down the road. But we're just gonna hop right into it with the first book that I read in February being Sweet and Bitter Magic by Adrienne Tooley. So this is a standalone YA fantasy, and in this book we follow 2 young women. One of them is Tamsin. She is a witch who has been cast out from the Witch Society because she broke the cardinal rule and performed dark magic. And while being cast out, she also is cursed with not being able to feel any sort of love or joy. And then we also follow Ren, who is kind of like just a very quiet village girl, but she is harboring the secret where she is actually a source of magic. And these sources are very coveted, and she's been hiding it so that she can stay and take care of her sick father. So then in this book, a magical plague starts swooping across the country, and it infects Ren's father, and so Ren goes and makes a deal with Tamsin, saying that she will give Tamsin her love for her father if Tamsin agrees to help her find the witch who is responsible for the plague and put an end to it. But as they journey together, they start realizing that Ren may not need to give Tamsin her love for her father anymore. It may be a different sort of love. I really enjoyed this book. It was a fun read, but overall it like wasn't anything spectacular or like new feeling. You know, I liked the general story. I loved the writing style and the magic system in it, particularly from Ren's point of view. Now, I found Ren to be kind of an annoying character just because she's very whiny, I guess, but her perspective of magic being a source, she's also able to like see and like physically experience magic with her 5 senses, so it was very vivid and colorful. You got lots of like smells and tastes and sounds, and it just was really fun to read from her perspective, and so I really liked that aspect, and Tooley's writing was very pretty to read. When we talked about kind of the magic and the 5 senses, I liked Tamsin as a character better. I thought that she was really well written. And I just liked kind of how you get like her coldness, but then you get her desire for being able to feel love on her own, and it was just, I thought, really well done, put together. But overall, you know, there was several predictable points of this story, and it just kind of felt like a general YA fantasy. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but nothing in particular besides Ren's perspective of magic really stood out to me. So overall, you know, I enjoyed this book, but it didn't feel like anything like groundbreaking or super special to me, and so I did end up giving it 3 stars. After that, I read Clara and the Sun by Kazuo Ishiguro. This is kind of a science fiction novel, but it reads very much like literary fiction, which is not a genre that I read a lot of, and it's also not one that I've had a huge amount of success when I have read it. Now, this book, we follow Clara. She is a AF, or an artificial friend. She's basically like an artificial intelligence robot person, and she spends her days in this store that sells artificial friends along with various other things, as she watches kind of the humans come in and out of the store and kind of hopes to be bought one day. And then she does end up getting bought by a young girl named Josie, who is very, very sick. And so we follow Clara as her and Josie kind of navigate Josie's illness, as well as just life in general. And then there is like a big turning point in this book where we get kind of a completely different perspective of Clara's role as an artificial friend. However, spoilers, I'm not going to talk too much about that, but I did really like that turn, and that was what I think made me overall really enjoy this book. It's not a bad book, I just don't think it's necessarily for me. I loved Clara as a narrator. She's this very optimistic yet naive character, yet she's got just this like sense of like hope and like lightness to her that it was portrayed really well through her narration. This is a very, very quiet novel. We follow Clara, and then we follow Josie, her mother, and maybe a couple other characters, but it's very close-circuited around just Clara and Josie in their quiet lives in this house on the countryside. However, we do get little snippets and sneak peeks into kind of like what the general world is like at this time and why there's a need for artificial friends, and kind of like how looking at that in terms of like science fiction, how that translates into the rest of this science fiction world. But overall it reads very much like just like a general contemporary fiction with just these little snippets of, oh right, this is kind of like a science fiction novel, if that makes sense. I don't know, like I said, I loved Clara, I loved the twist at the end, and I think the end after that twist, when it was all kind of brought together and you got a different perspective, that was where kind of the more hard-hitting topics and like thought-provoking moments were. That didn't happen until like 2/3 of the way through the book. The rest of it just didn't pack as much of a punch as I was hoping to, but like I said, I really just don't think that this necessarily was for me, but I did end up giving it 3 stars. Then the third book that I read is the Echostar Falcon by K.S. Veloso. This is the second book in the Chronicles of the Wolf Queen, or Chronicles of the Bitch Queen trilogy. So I read The Wolf of Orenyaro, that's the first one, last year, and that was actually in my top 10 of 2021 books. So I'm not going to tell you what the Echostar Falcon is about, because obviously that's the second book. But The Wolf of Orenyaro, we follow Queen Talion, and she is labeled the Bitch Queen, and she is said to have killed a man and exiled her husband, the Crown Prince, on the day of what was supposed to be their coronation, but ended up being just her coronation. And so she spends the next 5 years trying to hold this country together with this ruthless persona. But then she gets a letter from her exiled husband, who's apparently been chilling in this other country for the past 5 years, and he's asking to meet her in this other country in order to like reconcile and talk through kind of how they're going to repair their marriage and rule the country together. And so she meets up with her husband there while there, and then there's a huge assassination attempt. And so then in the chaos that ensues, Talion finds herself completely separated and lost in this country on her own. And she's trying to figure out what's going on, who she can trust, and how she can get home to a country that doesn't want her ruling there to begin with. And so then the Echostar Falcon is, you know, obviously the events that unfold after the first book. And I really enjoyed this second one. However, it lacked what I loved so much about the first book, which is just the fly by the seat of your pants. Both you as the reader and Talion don't have a clue as to what's going on, and you're just kind of like riding along this wave of Talion staying alive just by her sheer wit alone. And obviously it makes sense that the second book you would have more answers because it's the second book and you have to get answers somehow. But I just really loved the chaotic, certainty that was in the first book, and how Talion had to deal with that and make these split-second decisions, and just kind of there was this layer after layer removed, and you still needed all these answers even though like you were getting information, that was just lacking in the first one because we got so much information, but it was just so well done in the first one, and that's why I loved it so much. The second one was definitely just a little bit slower paced than the first one, but it definitely like commanded your attention just as much as The Wolf of Oren-Yara. Poor Talion is still such a messy character. She goes through growth, but she's still so messy, which is just really fun to read, and I thought was really impressive on Veloso's part. Now, this book is a very this whole trilogy, I should say, is a very tangled political fantasy. However, we kind of get more of the fantasy element of the story in the second book, and while I liked that, I think which is kind of weird because normally I like when we get more fantasy elements incorporated into political fantasies, but I loved the political aspect of the first book so much, and just kind of the different webs of lies and how tangled it all got, and like we still got that in the second one, but I felt like we had to kind of push it just off to the side just a bit to get more of the fantasy element incorporated in, which strangely enough I was kind of sad about. I just thought that the politics has been done so well in this trilogy, but overall I did really enjoy this. I'm actually currently reading the third book now, which I'll talk about in my March wrap up, but I gave the Echostar Falcon 4 stars. So then kind of throughout the first half of the month, I listened to the audiobook Disfigured on Fairy Tales, Disability, and Making Space by Amanda Leduc. So this is a nonfiction book. It's kind of part memoir of Amanda growing up and living with cerebral palsy, part essay about the representation of disability, starting from in traditional fairy tales all the way up through kind of like our modern representation of fairy tales, and I found this very insightful, very interesting, definitely touched on a lot of things that I never considered as an able-bodied person. However, it was too short in my opinion, especially because it's part essay, part memoir. I feel like with the memoir part added in and the length of the book, when it came to the essay part, there wasn't enough of like a delve into each of the topics. I also felt that each chapter kind of lost its train of thought, and kind of veered off into these weird tangents instead of staying on its like focused topic at least once each chapter. Many times there were specific fairy tale stories that were explained in detail and only to kind of pinpoint one element of it that talked about the disability rep that didn't seem to have anything to do with the focus of the chapter, and I just kind of got lost many times throughout this. I'm not sure if it's because I was listening to the audiobook instead of like physically reading it. I may have been able to follow the focus a little bit better if I was physically reading it, but it was just something that I noticed come up repeatedly throughout listening to this. And like I said, I just wish that she would have had more space to really delve into each topic and each focal point of the chapters, because there were some that I kind of wasn't sure exactly what she was trying to say, particularly the Marvel chapter. I kind of lost where she was trying to make her point, but overall, like I said, there was a lot of very insightful information in here. It definitely made me think about a lot of kind of the media that I love growing up and even now, but I did give this 3 stars. And then the 5th book that I read was my most anticipated read of this year, and also one of the biggest disappointments, and that is House of Sky and Breaths by Sarah J. Maas. This is the 2nd book in the Crescent City series. It's her adult fantasy series. It's her newest one. The first book was House of Earth and Blood, that came out in 2020, and I have been impatiently waiting for the 2nd book since I finished the first one 2 years ago, and This was not even on the same level as the first one. Not even on the same level. The first book, I was absolutely floored with like the intensity of the last 200 chapters and like how you could like just like feel the tension and the anxiety off of the page. And I was incredibly impressed with the intricacies of the world and even the plot itself, how just the littlest details in the very beginning of the book and even spread throughout the middle became such huge plot pieces in the very end. And I just felt that it was so intricately well done. And then we come along with this book and it was like, hello? What happened? Like, this isn't even on the same level. Like, we're not even on the same like spectrum when we look at like rating House of Earth and Blood and House of Sky and Breath. It's not. I'm like, how? This was so disappointing. Basically, in the first one, basic plot is that we follow Bryce Quinlan. She's half fae, half human, and she lives in this like high fantasy metropolis, and a murder happens and she gets wrapped up in the murder investigation along with a fallen angel named Hunt Athalar, and who's on the cover of this book, which by the way, they did my boy Hunt dirty. Bryce looked so good on the front of this cover and he just looks weird. I don't like it, and I'm really sad by how odd he looks, whereas the same art style made Bryce look just like ethereal and gorgeous and perfect, and I loved it. But this one just looks weird. And I should have known right from the get-go that if the cover with the style that I really enjoyed looks this funky and off here, I should have known. I should have known that that was gonna coincide with the book itself. I just, no. This suffered so hard from second book slump. So hard. And like, it blows my mind that this is happening in like her third series, because the Throne of Glass series was like her first series, and there was never a book that felt like it was just simply there as a transition piece. And there's 7 books in that series. I have not read Court of Thrones and Roses. I don't really have an interest in reading it, although I might need to, because it looks like that's like a continuing series, and it's just gonna keep going, and so now I'm like, well, I might need to read it now. So I can't talk on that one, but it's just weird that like she would have a second book slump now. Like, it just felt like nothing happened in this book. I didn't like where Bryce and Hunt's relationship went. What I loved so much about the two of them in the first book is like, yes, there was the romantic relationship, but it was built off of such a strong foundation of friendship and helping each other through grief. And then here it was just like horny central, and I was like, can we stop? Like, we lost so much of like what I loved about their relationship in the first book. I know smut comes with the territory of Sarah J. Maas. I know that, I get that, it's whatever, but there were 8 sex scenes in this book. 8. This book is 800 pages long. Do the math, that's 1 sex scene per 100 pages. Completely obnoxious and unnecessary. And it just made this book feel so much more pointless. I felt like 700 pages was just filler, and then 100 pages was actual plot that was like necessary to get us from book 1 to book 3. And I was so frustrated. We were nowhere near the level of like high action intensity that happened in like the last 200 pages of the first book. We got that maybe in the last 70 pages of this. Everything else, like every other like action piece that happened, I was just kind of like, oh, this is happening. Like, it just didn't feel as high stakes as like the first book. I also did not like how one character in particular seemed to be almost like the scapegoat of like how everything is falling into place. And I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. How would they have all of this time to do all of this stuff when like they were surrounded by people 24/7. It's like, it doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense. And I got sick of it, and it felt like a cheap cop-out in order to make everything work in this book, and I just didn't believe it. So I gave this 2.5 stars instead of like 1 or 2 stars, even though it's clear that I really did not like this, because I do really love these characters. I did really enjoy the world and kind of like where the story is going, and I'm very intrigued with kind of the reveals at the end and how Moss is going to make this work. I feel like it's going to go somewhere really well, and I did think that that was like set up pretty well. And I did also really like the mystics in this book. I found that whole aspect of the story, and when we got those scenes, very creepy and very fascinating, and I thought that that was really well written. So that's why I gave it 2.5 stars, because those were my winning points. But otherwise, this was a complete disappointment. I just am nervous for the 3rd book, and I really hope we get the 3rd book back on the same level that the 1st book was at, because this was not it. And then lastly, I read Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This is a literary fiction novel, and I'm actually going to read the back to you because I think that it just does a really good job of explaining generally what this book is about. It's really not that complicated, but it gives you a very good feel of the tone for this story. So it says, Lydia is dead, but they don't know this yet. So begins this exquisite novel about a Chinese-American family living in 1970s small-town Ohio. Lydia is the favorite child of Marilyn and James Lee, and her parents are determined that she will fulfill the dreams they were unable to pursue. But when Lydia's body is found in the local lake, the delicate balancing act that has been keeping the Lee family together is destroyed, tumbling them into chaos. A profoundly moving story of family, secrets, and longing. Everything I Never Told You is both a gripping page-turner and a sensitive family portrait uncovering the ways in which mothers and daughters, fathers and sons, and husbands and wives struggle all their lives to understand one another. This was absolutely gorgeous. Heartbreaking, but really impressive. So like I said earlier, I am not super well versed in literary fiction. It's not a genre I gravitate towards very often. It is one that I'm interested in and do want to kind of explore because I know that there are a lot of good literary fiction books out there, but I haven't had much luck with what I have picked up. This is an exception. I really enjoyed this book. So this is basically just like a character study and like just a portrait of this family, kind of getting us to the death of Lydia and then getting us past that point and kind of like just looking at how we got to Lydia dying and then how everybody copes with that afterwards. I think what impressed me the most was gives us this really clear snapshot of each character in such a short amount of time, and she puts this really clear focus on kind of what drives and motivates each character and what their desires are, and how that either complements or completely contradicts what other close relationship characters or kind of like what their drives and motivations are. You get a really good idea that each character has everybody else's best intentions in mind, but yet it's how that gets translated into kind of their actions and their words that end up being kind of detrimental to that other character. Is just so well done. There were many moments that I wasn't expecting to get choked up about, but Ng just focuses on like some of the really small details that pack like a really hard emotional punch. But if you're looking for kind of a character piece that focuses on unmet dreams, family, and grief, I really suggest you checking this out. I did give this 4 stars. So these 4 plus Echostar Falcon and Disfigured are the 6 books that I read in February. If you've read any of these books or if you are looking to read any of them, please let me know down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts, particularly if you felt the same way about House of Sky and Breath, or if you actually liked it. Because by the way, if you liked the book and if you had a really good time with it, I'm very happy for you. I'm glad somebody did. But yeah. As always, thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing if you haven't already. But I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!